Cool. Folks, thank you so much for joining in again. We have Giri, who will be leading the session on decoding SaaS vendor puzzle with Jimmy and OG. Giri, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Nimaz. So welcome everyone. So my name is Giri. I head the solution engineering and customer onboarding at Spendflo. And today we have a very interesting topic for conversation. So I believe choosing the right SaaS vendor is like solving a very intricate puzzle with a lot of moving pieces, right? So what we'll do in this session is we'll unravel the complexities and provide key insights into the art of making informed decisions, right? So whether you're a seasoned professional or new to the game, this session is going to promise a lot of things to you in terms of demystifying the challenges and empowering you to make strategic choices, right? So on that note, we have two experts with us today. Two wonderful gentlemen that I've had the opportunity to work with here at Spendflo. One is Omar Ghani, who's a VP of Procurement at CURO. In short, we call him OG. And we have Jimmy. Jimmy is the VP of Procurement Strategy at Spendflo and a very dear friend, right? So we have these two experts who will help us in demystifying the SaaS vendor puzzle, right? So on that note, Omar and Jimmy, if you can just introduce yourself to the larger group, and I think we can start the session.
Yeah, absolutely. Very nice to meet you all. And then as Gary mentioned, my name is Omar. I lead a financial services procurement function at CURO Financial Technologies. And a lot of my background has been related to building procurement teams. So some notable companies have been Lyft, the social media company, Reddit, and also some software companies such as Naven and TripAction. So really excited to be here. Have the great fortune of getting to partner very closely with Spendflo this year. And then Jimmy?
Yeah, so I am Jimmy Hallsworth. I come from Gong on my agenda for Spendflo, building out the procurement org there. I have a deep advisory background around procurement, specifically in doing transformations for orgs, whether it's net new or reinventing to fit more modern times of procurement. Because I think, as we all seen, I feel like procurement goes through this revitalization cycle or renaissance, probably about like every 6 to 8 years, and I think we're in the middle of one of those right now, coincidentally. But procurement nerd, I love this stuff. If anyone ever wants to just talk about procurement, I'll do it. I make my wife cut POs, so it's a good time.
So on that note, Jimmy, I like the point you brought up in terms of how the procurement cycle goes through a change every 6 years, and you're in the middle of it, right? So my primary question is around, what do you believe are the current challenges that we have with respect to buying SaaS in today's world? OG, do you want to start, and then probably, or Jimmy?
Yeah, OG.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of challenges. One is that there's a lot of information overload, in the marketplace, but every organization is also custom tailored to how their architectural tech stack is. And so one of the key questions that you have to figure out is like, hey, what actually works for my environment? What are the right integrations that these software providers can offer for me? And from a financial point of view, what are the right decisions that I have to make in the long term with a tech vendor? So it's relatively easy to make a decision on which software that you're going to be using, but it's a tougher decision to actually look at what the outcome of that decision is going to be from a 5 to 10 year journey of partnering with that software provider. And what I've always noticed in my career is that some of them are very successful. Some of them cost millions of dollars of impact by making the wrong decision. And so it's definitely a little bit of a decision to kind of be saying your organization is also transforming at the same time. And so you have to understand, do your vendor partners, evolve with you as you're going through a transformational journey? So those are at least some of the top things that I can think of. But what about you, Jimmy?
Yeah, I think you're on point for a lot of it. To me, it's that you don't know what you don't know. And in SaaS, there's always a new tool with a new problem it's trying to solve. And you're playing the game of, hey, that sounds great, but what does that mean to me? What are the impacts? Like, is there an ROI for it? Is it quality of life? Is it something we need, something we want? Is my business ready for wants? Right? There's so many different things you have to consider. It's kind of buying SaaS right now is like going into Costco without a plan, right? Like it's like, because there's so many different things that vendors are going to throw at you, as far as like, here's a sample to get you hooked. Oh, you shouldn't have signed that, right? There's all these little levers and mechanisms, and so it can be overwhelming. I think that data overload is like a really good way to say it. I mean, there's so much out there, and now we do all of that, and we're layering it now in like Gen AI on top of it. So now you have to not only navigate like the data rules and complications that you had 2 or 3 years ago. Now with everyone trying to layer in Gen AI, you have to think, okay, well, what does this mean 2 or 3 years down the road as we start to look to acquire tools? What risk do they, expose us to? What opportunities do they expose us to? So it's tough. I think too, the other one that really exists, and I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later, is the cross-functional challenges of buying SaaS, because everyone has their own vision of what they want to use the tool for, and very rarely in a smaller org are those visions purely aligned on like what our goals and objectives are for a tool. And so there's some negotiation happens internally as well as externally to bring all that together. So I think it'll be the next, I would say 12 to 24 months around SaaS buying in particular is going to be very enlightening on defining where we go from here. We've seen our industry move from kind of a compliance focused around purchasing to more of a like right size, like usage, like technical focus around purchasing and collaboration. And so knowing we've gone into the relational realm, right? It'll be, like I said, it'll be curious to see how that influences how businesses start to kind of think of procurement and SaaS in general versus just, hey, I need a tool, go buy one.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring that point up, Jimmy, right? Which is primarily going to be my next question. I think OG as well, he brought up the point of the fact that, it's important to map out the larger objectives of what you want to achieve with the vendor in 5-10 years from now. And you also brought up the point about needs and wants, right? So the problem with that is, this is probably my next question, is with so many vendors having very similar offerings or fringe offerings, right? How do you decide what tool to buy? And in the current context of, like you just said, where procurement is moving from more of a compliance-related, a process to a more vision-related process from around the departments, what are the factors that you consider when you choose a particular SaaS vendor in itself?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like as a procurement professional, there's a lot of flexibility that I look for, and so what I look at is price transparency, and it kind of goes back to the previous question about like, hey, like, are you quoting me based on my organizational company size and my revenue size, or are you actually quoting me based on the needs of what I truly need as a function? And I think these are for me, this question is actually the crux of how I negotiate with a vendor, because it lets me know, are they in the values realm that we see as a strategic partner growing forward versus a transactional partner? So I first try to understand, like, hey, what is the price transparency that they look for? Other things that I'm kind of also trying to understand as we go through these tough conversations, as Jimmy pointed, it's a lot of it is internal negotiations and actually getting in the buy-in of the internal team about like, why this tool? And so a lot of these questions that you take back to the vendors is like, what's your flexibility again? Is it going to be on giving pilot solutions? Is it that when you sign an agreement that I have the right to terminate if implementation is taking too long or it's not successful? And these are some of the key things that help us make decisions about, if things go well, it can go really well. But you kind of have to have the vendor have some kind of skin in the game to say, like, if things are not well, then we will own up to our decision to either course correct it or to admit that we have to, give them a refund, essentially. So, these are some of the things that I kind of, look for. And as I kind of like, look into all of these sort of realms, we also have to take a consideration about like, are these decisions going to be the right decisions for my broader ecosystem? And what I mean by that is, to Jimmy's point, when they try to sell to you, they'll say like, hey, look at all these other 5-6 other modules. And so you have to ask the questions like, do you go best of breeds, or do you actually do a consolidated campaign? And I don't want to say one's right or wrong. I can tell you what we're observing in the industry. What we're observing in the industry is that people are tending to go as a best of breeds approach. But that is kind of part of your evaluation about like, where you are in your organizational life cycle and your technology stack to make that decision.
Yep, and I think that's actually you bring up the best of breed thing. That's really and truly what I'm seeing as well, and what I saw when I was doing a lot of advisory work with Shelby was the suites for the most part, because the innovation in a suite is around adding more modules to that suite, right? Whereas like innovation to best of breed is furthering the technology or the opportunities around those particular tools. And I think that's where like it's if you're looking to just kind of be complacent, right? Like and you're in a good place and you're not looking to like, I would say, stretch the envelope too much, suite can work well, right? If you want to like, if you're more looking for disruptors or more looking for try to like finding that like the next edge, best of breed can work well. At the same time, best of breed can also take you down the wrong path, and it's harder to unpack from than a suite. So it's an interesting place. I think I tend to lead towards best of breed right now. I used to be a suite guy about like 5 years ago. So times are changing.
Just this one question. I'm just curious from what you just told, in terms of inclining towards the best of breed in terms of SaaS, right? So when you take suites, for example, right, what I wanted to understand, Jimmy, primarily from you is you said that, suites is about adding more stuff and increasing the SKU count at the end of the day when you work with a particular customer, right? So on that regard, I'd like to understand, what are the new levers that procurement teams are using today when negotiating SaaS tools? In the context of what you just told me about the suite in itself.
Yeah, it's a little different for each one, right? What's interesting and suites, once again, these have been around for a while as tools have tried to take over whole ecosystems. A lot of time with suites, like you're looking for throw-ins or value adds or opt-in pricing for particular tools or modules on those. But I think what's been curious on negotiating points lately, and we've been experimenting at Spendflo, and I had some success with some new approaches at Gong, is what levers can you negotiate that put it back in favor of actually keeping a deal right-sized, right? Holding the vendor accountable for the tools they're putting in. If vendors can put true ups in our agreements, we can put true downs, right? What can you do to make sure that like it's if you can charge me for overage, right? Then I want, whether it's credits or license transferability, what kind of flexibility can I get in there to make sure that I'm staying right-sized? I'm a big believer in looking for opt-outs right now because it's a vendor bet on yourself. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do opt-outs. It's not something that needs to be seen as a negative, but it's to hold the vendor and the success team accountable for, this is what you committed to us. This was the use case and the dream that you sold us. Help us reach it. I think for the longest time, especially with on-prem, you would buy a tool and you got what you got, right? And that was it. And early stage SaaS, it was very much you got what you got. I think as a SaaS industry, like providers have gotten better at giving some flexibility, and so you should be leveraging some of that, right? But there's I think we use, so at Spendflo we use like this 22-point like negotiation strategy, and it changes based on whether it's like usage based or whether it's seat based, right? It evolves a little bit. But you should be looking to protect the dollars you're investing in those tools, because you're not necessarily just paying for that company's innovation. You're paying for something that's going to help your company innovate and grow, right? And that's kind of, I think that's been one of the challenges is they sign the deal and they go away. And I had a previous CFO who, the one thing he told me is like, Jimmy, I'm not going to be picky about what we buy as long as there's a need, but what we won't buy is shelfware. And I agree with it, right? It's the one thing. So
yeah, Jimmy, you actually raised a really interesting point that I implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic, so just about 3 years ago, which is the concept of true down. And I love the statement that you made. And so one of the things that we've implemented when revenues crashed 75-80% and an attrition happened, we were starting to negotiate clauses to say like, hey, in the event that there's an employee attrition of 20+%, in the event that the consumption of these SaaS utilizations is down by X number of percent, then the contract is subject to renegotiation. And so these were one of the many things that I implemented in a past life to provide protection. And a vendor really needs to understand that it's like, hey, get rewarded for for true ups, but also be in the long-term journey of understanding that if you can help your customers survive through periods of economic uncertainty or competition uncertainty, and if they can get through that storm, then guess what? That customer is going to double down with you as a vendor partner in the future. And I think more and more procurement leaders are trying to actually advocate for that. And I think some vendor partners are actually understanding that now more than ever. It's a long-term partnership game.
Yep.
So, OG, I have a follow-up question on that, right? So you said, you like the fact that you look for true downs in contracts, and you want flexible payment terms in terms of opt-outs and all of these points that were brought up, right? So all of this primarily depends on how well SaaS is adopted within an organization, right? It's important, as much as buying is important for SaaS, it's also important that implementation happens really, seamlessly in the org where users get to adopt to it, right? But we do see in a lot of cases that there are a lot of hidden costs that are associated with SaaS adoption, right? So how can organizations in today's world plan for them? And what would be your recommendation on ensuring that you are protected against hidden costs when it comes to adoption of SaaS?
Yeah, so for the folks that are procurement, finance leaders, project management leaders in this audience, one of the few things that I would actually ask your internal stakeholders is that, hey, I don't want to see just the cost estimate of a software. I need to understand the cost estimate of the management of the program that you want to implement. And so what does that mean? It's like software cost is one line item. What's your estimated cost for implementation? What's your estimated cost for internal resources or contractors that you need to hire to manage the program? So a lot of these softwares that they're big investments and they require a lot of admin oversight. And so that's another thing to consider. And then 4 is actually what we just talked about a few minutes ago, which is like expect for the miscellaneous moments. Like, hey, do you have PAD about if there's a feature in the software that you didn't account for, but that is really crucial for an ROI, return on investment, that it promotes more revenue or promotes more cost savings? And so once you do a holistic budget evaluation, then you can kind of take it back to your CFO, your finance committee, your respective leader about making that decision about, is this what you want to do? And then the broader aspects then is like a comprehensive evaluation to do, and Jimmy, let me know what your thoughts are. Like, you either do a all-in-one package negotiation on all these kind of components, or you break it down and you do a, kind of best of breeds, where you go third-party implementation partners, or you go into other realms and you figure out what is the right package that best works for you. And so I think for the audience here, it's understanding like what is the investment program, not versus what is the cost of a software.
Yep, I think it's interesting you mentioned do you kind of bundle or go third party with some of those activities. It's what I've seen, right? Because I did a lot of the platform enabled transformations, at Shelby as a third party, and interestingly enough, there's a few things you have to account for that the customer kind of never sees, but they pseudo know are there. And one of those, like, so third party be great. You're going to probably get better results with a third-party partner who is all they do is deliver implementations, transformations, because most software companies are not professional services companies. They're software companies who have a professional services arm, but their main focus is innovation and ARR, right? As an organization, and professional services is a tool that gets them there. Once a company hits the portion where they start bringing in third parties for those kind of those transformations, the vendor itself start losing some of that revenue. And so there's this concept of a vendor tax that exists from having vendor PS oversight from this PS arm that they set up into having a third party. And that it's interesting is that vendor tax is mainly to tax the third party provider, not necessarily the customer, but that markup then gets passed through, right? And so it's being able to unpack that and see kind of what the inner workings are can maybe save you there. But I think third party, having a third party present, I've seen it where we've used even third party QAs for like certain parts of implementation where I've had pretty large ones. It just depends on, I guess, complexity, the tool you're doing, how many integrations, right? Do you use internal integration teams? Do you bring out third-party contractors to come in and lead some of those integration efforts. It'll all vary, but you're right. It's that line item view of how you kind of price out what your product is going to cost, or tool is going to cost, is so critical. And honestly, in a lot of smaller companies, it's something that's missed pretty frequently.
One thing to add here, I love that you mentioned the third-party tax, because I think many of us have gone through this experience. And so one of the recommendations that I would tell this audience is, don't sign your vendor software package until you have at least negotiated the third-party implementation cost. It doesn't have to be signed, but at a minimum, do not sign the software package until you negotiate them with the third party, because you can understand what the tax, that back end tax is, and how you can effectively negotiate back with the software providers, like, hey, this is kind of unnecessary. You need to be a little bit more fair, or else we won't be able to proceed with our decision. And so what a lot of software providers and sales folks will do is try to entice you at month end, quarter end, fiscal year end, and they try to ignore the whole implementation discussion. They say like, oh, well, that's for after you sign. That's for after you sign. And don't worry, we're going to give you the best recommendations for our preferred partners. But to Jimmy's point, that can really bite you in the later in the future, and then all of a sudden you don't have the appropriate budget. So use it in parallel, do it at the same time. That will help protect your budget to the best of your abilities.
Yeah. So, OG, it's interesting you bring that up, primarily because when you say that you go back and ensure that you're looking at the third-party services in terms of going back to the software vendor. Right now, this is going to involve multiple people within the org. You spoke about the fact that budgets are going to be super critical during this whole evaluation process as well, right? So in that regard, when it comes to matters of procurement, we typically see multiple teams internally working together to achieve a common goal. So the biggest challenge that a lot of companies face today is in terms of aligning all these parties that are involved in procurement, right? Say finance, your department heads, your legal heads, security heads for that matter. So how do you ensure that from a leadership standpoint in terms of how you operate procurement today within your org? So how do you ensure you align all these parties towards that one goal of choosing that vendor that's going to be the right choice for you in terms of meeting your business objectives?
Yeah, so I wish I had the perfect answer, and the honest answer is I'm still learning in this journey. And as to Jimmy's point, you're having this evolution in software management as the years progress. But I'm seeing two key themes, at least in my profession. One is on more of the strategic management side. And so what we're seeing is a rise of what's called software review councils, SRC committees. And so they're kind of the folks that, like, when a software request is put through, it's up to really procurement, finance, project managers to ensure that they funnel that information to a software review council to understand, is this tool actually needed? What's the level of importance behind it? Is it compliant with our standards? And do we do a comprehensive evaluation before we even determine if it's negotiation ready, or if it's pilot ready, or XYZ ready? That's one way that I think that we're seeing some enterprise organizations do it fairly well. But let's talk about, well, what if you're not an enterprise organization? What if you're, a mid-market or an SMB type of organization? And how do you kind of manage it from there? And so what I'm seeing work really well is the more tactical element of workflow management. And what I mean by workflow management is actually before the intake, before that requesting a purchase order, use a workflow to actually understand that, like, hey, is this going to the IT team for evaluation? Is this going to legal? Is this going to compliance for an early check-in? And so I think a lot of folks historically in the past will kind of ram through with legal, IT, compliance when they've made the decision, versus actually saying, like, we're starting an evaluation and we need to go through this checks and balance with all these respective parties. And I think a workflow system can be really intuitive to help them. So notable examples that I'm now seeing in the marketplace are, whether if it's Jira, whether if it's the new startup called LevelPath or Zip. A lot of these folks are now trying to address the pre-intake evaluation side to get all of these parties involved to make these appropriate decisions.
Agreed. Jimmy, your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I think he's. I want to make sure we have time for a little Q&A here. I saw something pop up on the side. But no, I think OG's right. I think honestly, at my previous stops, there has been like groups working in silos for the same goal, but they're just working independently and not coming together, and we're not collaborating. And so then it feels like when you're doing that you're burning extra energy, right? And so these workflow tools, bringing things into systems, having processes just in place to open the collaboration floodgates is great. And part of that means you got to make people accountable in the process. It's sitting down. Some of this sounds, like awful, but doing a RACI with your teams to say who owns what, getting the leaders aligned on who owns what, so that the ICs who are doing the work feel empowered to go and make decisions and drive action and drive.
Okay, so I think Jason here has a very interesting question, right? So he's asking, what are the pitfalls to avoid during SaaS negotiations? I think in the larger context of what you just told us, in terms of procuring and the things that you look out for when you're evaluating a vendor, right? So that's Jason.
Yeah, I think for me, like one of the things that people, and I'm going to use the Costco metaphor again, one of the biggest pitfalls I've noticed in SaaS procurement is it's so easy to sign up for a tool and to click on a link and get things started. And the risk that you put your organization in when you behave that way is very, very meaningful. There are click-through terms that give the vendor like uncapped liability in certain cases, like when you click through. And man, this free tool can all of a sudden become a very expensive tool if something happens or there's a breach because of how you're leveraging, et cetera, and exposes the vendor. So there's just a lot of there's a lot of, I'll call it, unknowns. I think now that you're bringing AI into it, there's also some like new layers on, as you buy, what do your overages look like, right? Do you have triggers in place to monitor and avoid those overages? You would be shocked at how many enterprise customers that I've worked with in the past who have come up and said, hey, we just got hit with a $100K bill that we weren't expecting because of overages. Well, like let's look at how we got there, right? Were you controlling usage? Were you monitoring it? And it was a middleware tool, and the way they were running their middleware tool was duplicative, and so it was pulling twice as much as it should have, and ran them right over their credits by doubling it. So it's just figuring out like what are those things? How do you avoid them? How do you negotiate them? I think you probably have some too, Omar, on your hit list.
Yeah, I mean, I want to quickly talk about what you said about like when things go excess in capacity. And so one of the things that you can ask your vendors during the negotiation process is, what are your controls about communication when things are getting to the limit? How do you actually communicate as partners? Like, hey, you've burned through 80% of your consumption, you have 20% left. We have recommendations to optimize it, or we have recommendations about getting ahead of and doing an upfront negotiation to understand how we can best serve you. So understanding that in the early days of your negotiation, I think, is important. I think kind of, looking at this question, I want to get to a very high level theme, and that's on the topic of emotional urgency. And I think a lot of times, as leaders, we get stakeholders that say like, we need this now. And if this doesn't happen, it'll compromise our annual goals as a company. And to Jimmy's point, it's so easy to sign something when you have an emotional emergency or emotional urgency that you actually have to, so much of being a finance, procurement, and IT leader is actually project managing these emotions and saying, let's make the most constructive decision possible that will help us navigate these decisions, not just from a financial impact, but what is the long-term impact and how it best really serves us at the end of the day. So I would say that's one. Another thing that I would really say here is in the context of if it's existing vendors and how do you avoid crazy spikes in a deal, make sure that your negotiation, your contract has negotiation caps, whether if it's a CPI index or all of these other things. Other things that I would really say here too is that don't negotiate last minute. What I really tell my staff is start negotiating when you know that you can walk away from a vendor. And what does that mean? When can I make the decision to implement an alternative vendor? And that can be sometimes 6 months or 8 months or 9 months before the renewal. But when you have that discussion so ahead of schedule, the vendor will be like, oh my gosh, why are you having this so early? It's because we want to make the decision that's best suited for our needs, not 1 week before renewal, because the vendor knows, and you cannot get out of a vendor if it's 1 week before renewal. So try to project manage, like, what is the point where the organization could theoretically walk away, and that's the ideal time to negotiate.
Yeah, I actually like that, Omar. It's interesting that I don't know how many times as a procurement person you almost hate the 90-day renewal notice, because you're like, we should have already been thinking, like no implementation of these larger suites or larger tools is taking 30 days, and then you have like 60, you're not going to go out and source and find something in the market that can rip and replace that quick. And that's one of the things that we started doing at Gong, was focusing on sentiment around tools while I was there, right? Was getting out, literally, to your point, during budgeting season. Hey, are you guys still happy? Do do you feel like you're getting here? We actually were running into it with it was an ATS, applicant tracking system, that we weren't necessarily a fan of. The renewal was in, to your point, 9 months. But we need to go ahead and start having conversations around it, because a good ATS is going to take us via integrations, et cetera, at least 12 weeks from an implementation standpoint. And that contract negotiation and sourcing around it's not short either. So I like that you call that out, because really and truly, it kind of goes back to our other point about getting groups to work together, is getting people thinking, getting your stakeholders thinking like that is a big evolution in like the experience you're going to have in procurement in that org. If people are thinking like that and they're doing it without your kind of prodding, you're going to be super successful. If you're prodding and they're not responsive, then you need to find ways to get them to be responsive.
Yeah.
Agree. So there's another question. I think we're running short of time. So I think this can be a good conversation, but in the interest of time, there's one more question to both Jimmy and Omar. How do I determine the scalability and flexibility of a SaaS solution that's tailor-made for my needs is the question. So who would like to take that?
And sorry, Gary, could you repeat that one more time?
The question is, how do I determine the scalability and flexibility of a SaaS solution that's tailor-made for my needs?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to what Jimmy was mentioning earlier in the conversation about how do you actually, when you sign up with a SaaS vendor, can you actually negotiate upfront what your theoretical 2 to 4 year forecast could look like? And when I say theoretical, don't commit to it, but say that it's like, hey, if I do happen to grow, then these are the discounts that I want to have. Or if I grow at a certain point, then my contract could be subject to reopening all over again, like open up the whole package of the contract ahead of schedule because you're growing with them. So that's, I guess, like on the topic of, scalability. The other thing that I would really say here is like, it's kind of going back to the topic of the pitfalls, and is the other aspect is like, if you know that you're going to be scaling, let's say by 50%, and you're 7-8 months away from the renewal, but you know that their fiscal year end is coming up in 3 months, for example, use these seasons as tactics, as ways to help. And it's, it's no surprise that your vendor parties will actually openly have these conversations. And in some cases, it may be beneficial for you. In other cases, it may not be beneficial for you. So kind of look at, what's happening, and kind of go from there. That's kind of what I would say. And what about you, Jimmy?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that my last CFO would always ask, both to me or the business, when we're looking at a tool and saying, does it, is it scalable and flexible enough? Is what happens if we don't have it? What happens if we never got it or don't renew it? What takes place? And so that's the first conversation that we have, right? If we, what does the world look like without it? Okay, now we bring it in. What does it take to get, like, what's that desired future state look like? What does it take to get us there? And then what happens as we grow with it, right? And I think, like, thinking about where we are now, where we would be if we removed, where you will be as you grow, is really important when you're having kind of that expectation conversation with the vendor. Because No one is buying a tool off the shelf and expecting it to work just like it does off the shelf. I think we've all sat through a million demos where we saw this perfectly functioning tool, and then we got our hands on it and we're like, wait a second, it's a little bit different. Your vendor should be open about that, right? When they're doing the demos and they're having conversations in how it's going to grow with you, how you need to, like, what you should be thinking about as you're setting it up and as you're having these conversations. If you're having a vendor who's having conversations with you and they're not talking about scalability and flexibility with how they set up their agreement, bring it out of them. Like, be very direct and have the conversation. Vendors, they expect it. They have playbooks on how to handle it. You know, like it's not going to be uncomfortable, but it needs to get out there in the open, and they need to know that you're thinking about it and you're aware of it, so that when you dig into the contract, right, they know what to look for. They'll actually call you to certain things in the agreements that'll talk to you about flexibility, et cetera. They'll kind of help you work through it. So.
Yeah, one of the key themes is, like, from a high thematic theme is, like, if you don't ask, you will never get it. If you do ask, there's high chances you will get something.
Yep.
So I think that's a good way, to close the Q&A. In fact, so in the interest of time, gentlemen, I'd like to hear your final closing thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, SaaS evolution is continuing to happen. I think in this marketplace, there is a lot of information overload, but there's a lot of really great strategic partners. I think, what we're seeing now is that there's a more concentrated effort in procurement and finance leaders to look at the balance sheet as it relates to software costs, and then also look at partners such as Spendflo that are helping address these things, because cost is king, especially in this economic and environment and valuation markets. So it's a really fun topic, and I'm happy to continue having these conversations in the future. So really happy to be here, and thanks for everyone getting to listen.
Yeah, I think for me, right, the world's changing. SaaS procurement is different. It is not traditional procurement. It is not here's my 60 line RFP, RFQ, right? Like even how we source it is different. 7 steps, it'll exist in manufacturing and some other industries, right? But it's not the same way, in today's procurement. I think we need to think differently. And it's great to see folks like Omar, right? Like in procurement leadership, like thinking outside of the box and innovating and finding new ways to bring value to both their internal stakeholders and also the vendors. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest takeaways I've had in the past 2 years, is that my vendor relationships matter just as much as my internal relationships, from a fact of, if I can help them see what I need for it to be successful at my company, it'll actually help them be successful with their other customers. And so having that conversation relationship really has kind of broadened things. But I love this stuff. I'll talk about it all day. Omar and I one day are going to sit down for coffee and leave 3 days later. When we chat about this stuff.
I'm sure we could be party to that as well. So on that note, gentlemen, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate all the insights shared, and I believe the audience found it useful as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.